Let's cut across to Shereen Bhan, who's in conversation with the former CA, KV Subramanian. Shereen, over to you.
Well, guys, good morning and thanks so much for joining us here on Budget 2024. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is going to be ready to present her sixth consecutive budget, creating history in a way. And, you know, we brought in Tarun Bajaj, the former Revenue Secretary, as our budget editor here last year. And it is my pleasure to have with us KV Subramanian, the former Chief Economic Advisor, joining us as budget editor today. You would have been in Parliament with the Finance Minister 2 years ago. Today, you're sitting here with us in the CNBC-TV18 studio. So thank you very much. Look, let's understand the context of this interim budget. It is the last budget of this term of the Modi government ahead of the general elections. We go into this budget with a feel-good factor. So the finance minister is going to be mindful of not wanting to change that mood. If you look at the review that the government has put out, it goes into the interim budget from a position of confidence, both as far as growth is concerned, as well on the fisc. So on balance, do you expect this budget to directionally signal what the government may or may not do if it were to be voted back to power, or do you think that there may be some new announcements this time around?
I think it'll be both. I think our viewers have to understand that this is a vote on account, and therefore what the government is really doing is essentially getting an approval from Parliament for spending for a few months till the actual budget.
But 2019 was a vote on account. Piyush Goyal delivered PM Kisan.
Yes. So my contention, and because I was at that time part of the government, I can tell you the two measures, PM Kisan was there and there was actually a increase in the standard deduction. But as we discussed a couple of days back, PM Kisan to me is actually was a very good move from an economic perspective. At that time I had mentioned that, you know, because if you take a farmer who, let's say, earns about 20,000 rupees a month, for that farmer, the 2,000 rupees a month is 10% of his income. That's a significant amount. And importantly, that amount for sure will come to him or her, right? And that takes care of some of the left-tailed risk and which will bring in investment. So this paper by Pulak Ghosh and a PhD student from University of Chicago Booth School of Business have actually shown that that has indeed happened. So in some sense, it was a very good move from an economic perspective. Yes, it may have actually helped them garner votes, but I think that's beside the point.
So a higher allocation, given the consideration?
Yes. I would say that if we take into account the average inflation that has prevailed, about 5.5% over the last 5 years. So if we account for that in real terms, I think an increase of about 30% would be justified to keep the real amount the same. So anywhere about 8,000 rupees, 7,800 to 8,000 actually would be, you know, in real terms would remain the same. And I think anything more than that would mean that they're actually giving more to take care of some of the left tail risk. And just to finish the thought, I think the other part you mentioned, which is the vision, I think that is something which, you know, one is likely to see. The Honorable Prime Minister has talked about Amrit Kal, the fact that the coming 25 years, I think, is a very important phase for India. I'm in the process of writing a book, India at 100, where actually, you know, I resonate with those thoughts. And therefore, I think a vision for how India is positioned now and how it will look to grow forward, I think, would be something that will be very, very well justified.
You know, I don't know if our viewers can see this, but KV Subramanian's got notes lined up on our budget table here. And of course, he's got his laptop as well, and he's been going over the numbers. You know, as far as Capex is concerned, and this has really been the big one as far as the government is concerned, in this interim budget, do you really expect a big number? Because that, I would imagine, would be left for July.
Yeah, just to respond to, you know, you would remember, actually, I like responding with data and you know, a lot of numbers. I think sometimes actually memory fails me, and so it's just useful to have them with me. So I think that point is well taken, that, you know, in a full budget, the capital expenditure amount, actually specifying it makes sense. But in a vote on account, it's possible that that number may actually, maybe the Honorable Finance Minister may decide not to talk about it, which may be the right thing to do, because, you know, capital expenditure, you need the outlay for the entire year. And therefore, the actual number that we may want to, you know, note carefully would be when the full budget is presented.
That's right.
But I think a vision, and my humble submission, you know, would be that the push on capital expenditure that we've done post-COVID is something that should be continued. And I'm a firm believer that many of those commentators...
But the 35% kind of increase that we've seen, or do you believe that it will be tapered down?
Well, the way I look at it, actually, rather than looking at the number from a supply side perspective, 35%, I would rather look at it from the demand side perspective. If we look at our infrastructure, if we have to indeed become an advanced economy like the Honorable Prime Minister has envisioned, then our infrastructure has to be of the level of advanced economies. And that is basically the way I look at it from the demand side. And from my perspective, when we look at the fiscal math, I think the two most important numbers are we generating enough growth by investing that capital expenditure to make sure that the R minus G differential is sufficiently negative to offset any primary deficit there will be. Those are the two numbers. If that is, I would not go by 30-35%. I would just go from the demand perspective. What we need to build in infrastructure, we should go ahead and provision for that.
And I'm speculating here, but what I heard from the Prime Minister, what we heard from the President in her speech, my gut tells me we're going to see a focus on women as far as this budget is concerned. Do you concur?
I think I would. In fact, the Honorable Prime Minister, as is his wont, he actually coined this acronym GYAN, right? Where G for Garib, Y for youth, and then A for the farmer, the Annadata, and N for Nari. So I think, of the 4 pillars, N is for Nari. So I'm sure, there'll be something for women, definitely. One aspect that I would definitely want to highlight, and the CA's report has clearly brought this to attention, the female labor force participation ratio has increased significantly, especially in the rural areas, and this is over a 5-year span from about 26% to 41%. And that is something which is not just because of, women sort of joining their, let's say, the spouses at work. It is because their time is now getting saved. Now they are not having to spend as much time, cooking, because the LPG connections that have been given, they don't have to spend as much time maybe walking miles to get water. Right? All that has made them more productive, and therefore their household activities are taking less time, which is basically saving them time to be productive, at work as well. So I think that's a very good sign. To supplement that and just to push that further, I think, a focus on women would be absolutely welcome.
PM Garib Kalyan has already been extended. It's happened outside of the budget. Even as far as the Ujjwala scheme is concerned, there has been tweaks and more sweeteners provided. Do you believe that that could be something more on some of these existing social sector welfare schemes?
I reckon there may be, some additional provision for the PM Awas Yojana. Because again, that ties in with the theme that I mentioned about capital expenditure. While of course infrastructure creation creates these big, huge assets for the nation, but PM Awas Yojana creates assets at the household level.
And more on the rural side, you think that's going to be the emphasis?
Yes, on the rural side. And, from a household's perspective, I remember, in 2000 when we had bought a house, my parents were so happy because for the first time we had a house to call our own. And therefore I can relate to actually people who want to have their own house. I think outlays increase in PM Awas Yojana would be something that I might expect.
Okay. Crunch time. What is the sense that in Parliament, when you were part of the Finance Minister's team, what's the last minute prep ahead of the budget speech?
Well, so I must actually remind, the first couple of times, the first time especially when I was part of, that cavalcade goes from the President's, Rashtrapati Bhavan to Parliament. I was like a kid in a candy store, enjoying that moment. And being able to see history being, sort of written is, I think, for me, each occasion, I was part of 4 budgets. I had basically goosebumps every time. And, I think it's, of course, a privilege to be able to contribute to the nation. I just want to wish absolute good luck to ma'am for the budget.
6th budget, will Nirmala Sitharaman deliver a 6th? And what is it that you would be watching out for in terms of key numbers?
Well, as a cricket fan, I actually would like to see a 6 there. A 6th time, chakka maro.
So the numbers that you're going to be watching out for? Fiscal deficit?
So, yes. I think, 3 numbers as we had discussed a couple of days back. I think the real growth number, my sense is 7%. I think for the budget projections, the nominal growth number matters far more. Because that's how the tax projection is done, tax revenue and the non-tax, non-tax revenue as well. So GDP deflator, I would expect it to be about 4%. You know, the time where there was basically a lot of sort of movement to the WPI inflation, you know, 2 years back it was going up very high and then negative last year. Some of that I think is behind us. So we can expect the deflator to be at the median of the 2 to 6% band at 4%, which would translate into nominal growth of about 11.3%. If we take a tax buoyancy, and I'm actually being very conservative here in the tax buoyancy that I'm assuming, and for the benefit of viewers, tax buoyancy basically remove the jargon. It is just if there's a 1% increase in GDP growth, what is the percentage increase in tax revenue? That's what tax buoyancy is. So if it is 1.2, then a 1% increase in GDP growth will translate into 1.2% increase in tax revenues. So if you multiply 11.3% by 1.2, you get about 13.5% as the... Now, the reason I'm saying this is conservative is if you look at the last 10 years, and I've actually looked at the data, the average tax buoyancy ratio has been about median and you know mean has been about 1.5 to 1.6.
Okay.
So 1.2 is very conservative compared to that. So 13.5% increase in revenue, that's the number I would be watching. The third number, which then implicitly leads to the fiscal deficit, is the change in the expenditure. And my sense is if the expenditure increases by about 8% or thereabouts, with a 13.5% increase in revenue, I think they'll be able to get a fiscal deficit of 5.2%, which will then be sort of, a commitment to the fiscal consolidation path leading up to 4.5% for FY26.
Yeah, and as far as disinvestment, privatization, I don't imagine that this is going to be the budget that we hear anything more on that front.
Yes. No, this is one area where I think, more needs to be done. Even when I was in the government, I used to sometimes actually, mention this and bring this to the attention that even in my conversations with the secretary, I think we need to do more for sure. As you would recall, I'd written a chapter on privatization, so I am, because that leads to a lot of productivity improvements, I'm all for it. But this is not the year that they will talk about it. I would expect...
This is certainly not the budget that they will talk about.
It's not the budget, exactly. I think, thanks for the correction. Yeah. Quite likely they'll talk about it in July, or, end June or July when the budget for the new government comes in.
Okay, that is our budget editor, KV Subramanian, with us at our budget headquarters in the capital. Of course, we are counting down to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's 6th budget. Markets are trading, and let me toss it back to you guys in the studio, and we'll join you again in a short while from now. Lata.
Thanks a lot for that, Shereen. Okay, we have another